It was certified. It passed inspections. It was signed off by regulators. And yet, many people inside the aviation world quietly believed this aircraft should never have been allowed to fly. On paper, it looked like just another upgrade, a familiar shape, a trusted name. Pilots saw a cockpit they recognized. Airlines saw fuel savings. Passengers saw nothing unusual at all. But hidden beneath that sense of normalcy was a chain of decisions that would eventually cost hundreds of lives and shake public trust in aviation like nothing had in decades. The aircraft was the Boeing 737 MAX. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to go back to the pressure Boeing was under. Airbus had launched the A320neo, an aircraft that burned less fuel and promised airlines huge savings. Orders poured in. Boeing was suddenly on the defensive. Designing a brand new airplane would take years, and airlines didn't want to wait. So Boeing made a choice that would define everything that followed. Instead of building a clean-sheet aircraft, they decided to stretch the 737 design even further, a design that first flew in the 1960s. Bigger, more efficient engines were added, but there was a problem. The 737 sits low to the ground. Those new engines didn't quite fit. The solution was to mount them higher and farther forward on the wing. That change may sound minor, but aerodynamically it was. The aircraft now had a tendency to pitch its nose upward during certain flight conditions, especially at high angles of attack. That behavior didn't exist in older 737 models, and it was something Boeing knew regulators would scrutinize. So another decision was made. A software system called MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, was added. Its job was simple in theory. If the aircraft sensed it was pitching up too much, MCAS would automatically push the nose down. The problem wasn't that MCAS existed. The problem was how it worked. MCAS relied on data from a single angle of attack sensor. One sensor, no cross-checking, no redundancy. If that sensor failed, MCAS could activate repeatedly, forcing the nose down again and again, even if the aircraft was flying normally. And here's the part that still leaves aviation experts shaking their heads. Most pilots didn't even know MCAS existed. Boeing's promise to airlines was that the 737 MAX would fly like earlier 737s. That meant minimal simulator training, lower costs, faster adoption. So MCAS was barely mentioned in manuals. In some cases, not mentioned at all. Pilots were expected to handle it instinctively without knowing what they were fighting. In October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta. Shortly after departure, faulty sensor data triggered MCAS. The system pushed the nose down. The pilots pulled back. MCAS pushed down again. This cycle repeated over and over. Confusion filled the cockpit. Warnings blared. The aircraft entered a dive and crashed into the sea. 189 people were killed. At first, the world was told it was a maintenance issue, a foreign airline, a one-off tragedy. Boeing continued to defend the aircraft. Regulators did not ground it. Then, less than 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa. The flight lasted 6 minutes. The same sensor issue, the same MCAS behavior, the same desperate fight for control. Another high-speed dive into the ground. 157 more people died. Only then did the truth become impossible to ignore. This wasn't pilot error. This wasn't poor maintenance. This was a design philosophy that prioritized speed, cost, and competition over transparency and redundancy. An aircraft that behaved differently than pilots were told it would. A system that could overpower human input without clear warning based on a single point of failure. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide, something almost unheard of in modern aviation. Investigations would later reveal internal emails, missed warnings, and a regulatory process that relied too heavily on manufacturer self-certification. The FAA, once considered the gold standard, was criticized for trusting Boeing too much. Engineers inside the company had raised concerns. Some were ignored. Some were overruled. Some simply ran out of time. This aircraft was certified, but certification, it turned out, didn't mean what people thought it meant. And the most uncomfortable question of all remained unanswered. If this airplane had required full transparency, full pilot training, and full disclosure from the start, would it ever have been approved to fly at all? By the time the 737 MAX was grounded around the world, the damage went far beyond 2 tragic crashes. Airlines were scrambling. Thousands of flights were canceled. Aircraft sat idle on runways, wrapped in plastic and silence. Pilots, many of whom had trusted the airplane with their lives, were suddenly questioning what they'd been trained on and what they hadn't been told. But the real reckoning was happening behind closed doors. As investigations deepened, a disturbing picture emerged. Internal messages showed Boeing engineers expressing concerns years before the crashes. Some worried MCAS had too much authority. Others questioned why it relied on a single sensor. One message bluntly stated that the system was being designed in a way that could mislead regulators. And regulators were misled. The FAA had delegated large portions of the certification process back to Boeing itself. This wasn't illegal. It had become standard practice over time, built on decades of trust. But trust, without strong oversight, can quietly turn into complacency. Critical details about MCAS were not fully communicated. Changes to the system increased its power, but those changes were not treated as significant enough to require new pilot training. The assumption was that pilots would recognize the problem and react correctly within seconds. While alarms blared, the aircraft pitched down and the ground rushed closer. That assumption proved fatal. When test pilots later recreated the failure scenarios in simulators, even they struggled. Experienced professionals, fully briefed, sometimes failed to recover in time. That raised a terrifying question. What chance did line pilots have in a real cockpit at low altitude with no warning that such a system even existed? The fixes, when they came, were extensive. MCAS was rewritten to use data from both angle of attack sensors. Its authority was limited. It could no longer activate repeatedly without pilot input. Alerts were made standard. Training requirements were expanded. Full simulator sessions became mandatory. In other words, the aircraft had to be fundamentally changed to become what it should have been from the beginning. The MAX eventually returned to service, but not without scars. Boeing's reputation took a massive hit. The FAA's credibility was damaged. Families of the victims were left with answers that came too late and accountability that, for many, felt incomplete. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable for all of us. Because the 737 MAX wasn't built by villains. It was built by people working inside a system that rewarded speed, competition, and cost-cutting. A system where deadlines mattered more than dissent. Where raising concerns could slow programs and threaten careers. Where good enough quietly replaced fail-safe. Aviation is often described as unforgiving, and that's true. It allows no room for assumptions, no margin for hidden flaws. When something goes wrong at 35,000 feet, there is no reset button. That's why this aircraft still divides opinion today. Some argue the MAX is now one of the most scrutinized airplanes ever to fly. Others believe it represents a warning sign, a moment when commercial pressure pushed too hard against safety culture. A reminder that certification is not just paperwork, and trust must always be earned, not inherited. The phrase "should never have been allowed to fly" isn't about saying every MAX flight today is unsafe. It's about acknowledging that the aircraft, as it was originally designed and certified, crossed a line that modern aviation had promised never to cross again. And perhaps the most important lesson isn't about one airplane, one company, or one regulator. It's about what happens when transparency is treated as optional, when pilots are left out of the loop, when systems are built to hide complexity instead of managing it, when silence becomes easier than speaking up. Aviation safety is written in lessons learned, often paid for with lives. The 737 MAX joined that list not because of one failure, but because of many small decisions that aligned in the worst possible way. Certified, yes, but safe by design? That question should never have taken 2 crashes to answer. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe understanding these moments makes flying safer for everyone, then support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive, honest, and grounded in reality.